With Wolf Hall Series 2 having completed filming and hopefully on our screens soon, I thought the time would be right to explore the lives of two of the men who owed much of their success to Thomas Cromwell, but who would eventually go on to turn against him, these men being Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Rich. Both would become infamous for their unscrupulous and at times frankly cruel behaviour, using whatever means possible to reach their goals. Both famously turned the wheel of the rack against Anne Askew when she was subjected to torture. But who were these men? What were their early lives like? How did they come into Cromwell's service? And why are they viewed as such major Tudor villains? Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 45, Wriothesley and Rich, Henry VIII's evil councillors. Before I go any further, just a quick one. As some of you may have picked up on, Thomas Wriothesley's surname is pronounced Wriothesley. To the untrained eye, its spelling would suggest that it's pronounced Wriothesley, and in fact, in a few audiobooks, I've heard it pronounced that way, but that is very much incorrect. It is Wriothesley. The late Hilary Mantel actually uses this as a point in her 3-book Wolf Hall series, for the nickname that Thomas Cromwell gives Wriothesley is Call Me, coming from the fact that he often has to say to people, call me Wriothesley. The court of King Henry VIII has variously been described as a snake pit, an ever-changing, volatile and dangerous place where one could experience great reward, only for it to be snatched from you and your life with it shortly after. Such an environment was naturally going to produce figures of daring and callous nature, but Richard Rich and Thomas Wriothesley are particularly infamous for their willingness to tread on whomever they felt would hinder their rise to greatness. Putting their own interests before anyone else or anything else, both men would bend their will to whomever sat the throne and would bend their opinions accordingly. They held no scruples, which perhaps explains why they, particularly in Richard Rich's case, led long lives without ever coming close to an appointment on the executioner's scaffold. Of the two, Richard Rich was the elder. He was born sometime in July of 1496 in Basingstoke in Hampshire, the second son of Richard Rich by Joan Dingley. As he was not of noble birth, his actual date of birth is not recorded, but can be narrowed down to 1496, for in early 1551 he was described in an official document as 54 years of age. Richard had a brother, Robert, although whether he was older or younger is completely lost to history. Thomas Wriothesley was Richard Rich's junior by 9 years. He was born in London on the 21st of December 1505, the son of the York Herald, William Wriothesley. Thomas had two sisters, Elizabeth, born in 1507, and Anne, born in 1508. He also had a brother, Edward, who was born the following year in 1509. All we know of Thomas Wriothesley's early life is that he received his early education at St Paul's School in London. Little is known of Richard Rich's early days, but it would seem that he studied at Cambridge University, studying law, which he concluded in 1516, for it was that year that he entered the Middle Temple as a lawyer, and at some point between 1520 and 1525, he was a reader at the New Inn. In 1518, 2 years after leaving Cambridge, he married Elizabeth Jenks. The couple would go on to have a whopping 16 children, 6 boys and 10 girls. Wriothesley would follow in Rich's footsteps, for in 1522 he was admitted to Trinity Hall, Cambridge, where he was taught law by none other than Stephen Gardiner. Although Wriothesley did not take a degree and would grow to become an ardent supporter of religious reform, he and Gardiner remained lifelong friends. In 1524, at the age of 19, he entered a career at court and came to the attention of Thomas Cromwell. Shortly after Wriothesley came to the attention of Cromwell, in 1528, Richard Rich was also in search of his own patron as a means of advancement, and wrote to Thomas Wolsey. This led to an introduction to both Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Audley, the latter of whom, in 1529, succeeded in getting Rich elected as an MP for Colchester. As Audley and Cromwell grew ever more powerful, Richard Rich benefited by association and would take on a string of legal posts and positions under Cromwell's watch. Around this same time, Wriothesley was also experiencing his own elevation through the court ranks, for around April of 1530 he was appointed as joint clerk of the Signet under Stephen Gardiner, who was, by this point, secretary to Henry VIII. Wriothesley would hold this post for a decade while continuing in Thomas Cromwell's service. It was around this time that Wriothesley showed his skills in manipulating the law, being described as able, enterprising, tenacious and ruthless, yet insufferably overconfident and egotistical. Unlike Rich, who was not heavily involved in the king's great matter, his attempt to separate from Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, Thomas Wriothesley was involved, for he was made a member of the Royal Secretariat and was charged, alongside William Brereton, with helping to secure the annulment. Part of Wriothesley's role involved him being sent out to get members of the nobility to sign written statements indicating their assent to the annulment. It was around this time that he married Jane Cheney, the daughter and heiress of William Cheney of Chesham-Bois in Buckinghamshire, by whom he would have 3 sons and 5 daughters. That Richard Rich was not heavily involved in the process of the King's Great Matter does not mean that he was entirely absent at the time. Indeed, in 1533, the first year of Anne Boleyn's reign, he was knighted and became the Solicitor General for England and Wales, in which capacity he was to act under Thomas Cromwell as a lesser hammer for the demolition of the monasteries and to secure the operation of Henry VIII's Act of Supremacy. He was one of the men who personally examined Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent, and it was during this time that Richard Rich first emerged as a frankly evil character, for he would play a major role in the trials of Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, with the evidence Rich brought forward, particularly against More, being twisted to ensure that both men were convicted of treason and subsequently beheaded. With Bishop Fisher, Richard Rich tricked the elderly man into admitting his loyalty to the papacy, whilst promising to tell no one, only to then pronounce the bishop's statements during his trial. With Thomas More, Richard Rich visited him in the Tower of London to question him on his views on the Act of Supremacy. Thomas More had cleverly avoided ever openly voicing his opinion, which had for the longest time been accepted by the king. More's silence was seen as compliance, until it wasn't. Richard Rich claimed that More had told him a parliament can make a king and depose him, but a subject cannot be bound, so in the case of supremacy. Whilst on trial, Thomas More said that Rich was always reputed light of his tongue, a great dicer and gamester, and not of any commendable fame. Rich's sly machinations resulted, as I referenced a moment ago, in More's eventual death. Further preferments came as Thomas Cromwell grew in ever greater favour, leading to Richard Rich's position as the King's Solicitor. In this role, he travelled to Kimbolton Castle in January 1536 to take the inventory of the goods of Catherine of Aragon, and wrote to Henry VIII advising how he might properly obtain her possessions. On the 19th of April 1536, just 1 month before the execution of Anne Boleyn, Richard Rich became the Chancellor of the Court of Augmentations. In this role, he worked in partnership with Wriothesley and Thomas Cromwell to dissolve the abbeys, monasteries and nunneries in England and Wales, displacing thousands of people from their livelihoods and completely upending a way of life going back centuries. Naturally, both men's services were richly rewarded following the dissolution of the monasteries. Wriothesley was granted extensive lands between Southampton and Winchester, once belonging to the abbeys of Beaulieu and Titchfield, whilst Richard Rich was given huge swathes of land and property taken from the church. In Essex alone, for example, around 100 manors came under his ownership. The great irony, however, was that Richard Rich would remain nominally Catholic, never converting to what we would now recognise as Protestantism. Despite this, he also acquired and destroyed the real estate and holdings of the Priory of St Bartholomew the Great in Smithfield. He was responsible for the building of the Tudor-style gatehouse, which still survives in London as the upper portion of the Smithfield Gate. It was thanks in no small part to both men's actions that the series of protests, now known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, first started. Thomas Wriothesley was at Windsor with the royal court when the troubles broke out, and it has been claimed that although Wriothesley admired the king, he likely learnt lessons in cruelty from the treatment that was eventually meted out on Robert Aske, for it was said that it was upon such men that the king relied at times of crisis. Another of the great positions granted to Wriothesley was as ambassador in Brussels, which he held until May of 1539. In late 1539, when Anna of Cleves was due to come from the German Principality of Cleves to England for the forthcoming wedding to King Henry VIII, Wriothesley was selected to lead the naval escort. On the 27th of December, Anna arrived at Deal in Kent, and from there she was taken to Dover Castle. On New Year's Day, the party reached Rochester Castle. Although Wriothesley outwardly showed support for the Duke of Norfolk's Catholic-led faction, he did this only when it suited him at court, as parties emerged between the Reformists, led by Cromwell and the Seymours, and then the Conservatives, such as Norfolk, but also the Poles and the Courtenay families. In 1540, Thomas Wriothesley was made one of the King's principal secretaries, a position that he held jointly with Sir Ralph Sadler, who was another firm member of Cromwell's faction, and who, unlike Wriothesley and Rich, would always remain loyal. Wriothesley and Sadler divided their duties, with Sadler acting as personal secretary to the king, whereas Wriothesley's duties were purely political. He was knighted in 1540, becoming Sir Thomas Wriothesley, and he soon became a firm friend of Sir Anthony Browne, who acted as an armed bodyguard of the king. Wriothesley, having earned his place at court as a faithful attendant to Thomas Cromwell, betrayed Cromwell in 1540, telling the king that Cromwell was indiscreet about Henry's inability to consummate his marriage with Anna of Cleves. This news, coupled with the Cleves alliance threatening war with Emperor Charles V, proved to be Thomas Cromwell's undoing. Wriothesley happily lied to the council and betrayed his master in order to take his place beside the king. He was not alone in this fact, for Richard Rich also turned on his former close ally and ultimately the man who had been the benefactor of his great wealth and acquisitions of land. Like Wriothesley, he claimed to be a chief witness to Cromwell's treasonous talk, his designs for the throne, and his supposed heresy. Thomas Cromwell made his opinions of Rich known personally to Henry VIII in a letter following his arrest. From prison he wrote, "What Master Chancellor has been to me, God and he knows best. What I have been to him, your Majesty knows." Richard Rich's lack of morals and scruples is perhaps most evident when we look at what happened not long after Cromwell's execution. For on the orders of Richard Rich, in July 1540, 3 men were burned at the stake, declared heretics for preaching doctrine opposed to King Henry's 6 Articles of Faith, and on the very same day, 3 more men were hung, drawn and quartered for having denied the royal supremacy. And so on that very same day, 3 evangelicals and 3 Roman Catholics were put to death at the hands of Richard Rich for supposedly opposing the king's doctrine. This is unsurprising, however, for Richard and Wriothesley, as I have covered, would change their views like the wind. And so when, like a pendulum, favour swung away from the court conservatives, particularly in 1538, with the old White Rose families of Pole and Courtenay being destroyed, and following Queen Catherine Howard's conviction and execution for adultery, which greatly diminished the Duke of Norfolk's power, Richard Rich and Thomas Wriothesley soon changed sides. On the 13th of November 1541, Wriothesley was sent to announce the bad news to the members of Queen Catherine's household at Hampton Court. All of her staff were dismissed and sent home. Like Cromwell had done before him, by 1542, it was said that Wriothesley governed almost everything in England. Moving back towards the traditions of the Catholic faith, he sought to bring about an alliance between England and Spain in 1543, and was one of the council, led by the Catholic Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who ordered the imprisonment of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, the Duke of Norfolk's son, for being drunk and disorderly. He also supported Gardiner's crackdown against Lutheran opinions, and with that, all Protestants were being rooted out of the royal household, with those of the new extreme Puritan sect, Calvinism, being treated with particular prejudice. The council even intimidated Archbishop Cranmer, who was protected by the king himself. Although we like to think of King Henry VIII as a Protestant, this is not actually true, for he remained a Catholic until his dying day, just one of his own creation. He was, however, not prepared to turn the clock back to the pre-1530s, and Catherine Parr, the king's final wife, impressed Wriothesley by offering Henry stability in his old age. Furthermore, as governess to Princess Elizabeth, bringing the children to court at Christmas in 1543, Catherine Parr showed off what Wriothesley had accurately predicted to be Elizabeth's promise as a future leader. One man that Wriothesley did not get along with was Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, brother of Queen Jane. On the 22nd of April 1544, Lord Audley died, leaving Wriothesley to be appointed Lord Chancellor the next month, at a time when Stephen Gardiner's power was waning. Ever the unscrupulous schemer, Wriothesley was purposely driven to keep both Papists and Reformists at bay. The king relied heavily on his bestie, the Duke of Suffolk, and the more lowly Wriothesley to secure a balance of power in the Privy Chamber. As the king prepared an invasion of France, much to the nobility's approval, Wriothesley was created Baron Wriothesley of Titchfield in 1544. His most famous and darkest act as Lord Chancellor would be his and Richard Rich's hand in the torture of Anne Askew. In what would be tantamount to a witch hunt, Wriothesley, Richard Rich and Stephen Gardiner began to work on discrediting and upending minor evangelicals in the hopes of uncovering the most major Protestants at the royal court. Their primary targets were the Queen herself, Catherine Parr, despite Wriothesley having previously shown favour towards her, and then Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, and of course Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. One such evangelical was the 25-year-old gentlewoman Anne Askew. Although likely a friend of Catherine Parr, Askew was nonetheless unwilling to testify with whom she was associated. Rich and Wriothesley, in an attempt to force a confession out of her, tortured the poor woman, personally racking her by turning the wheeled levers themselves. Although torture is closely associated with this time in history, it was actually quite rare and was never to be meted out on a woman. Such was his disgust at the treatment of Anne Askew that the Constable of the Tower of London refused to participate and rushed to court to inform the king. Before he could gain an audience, however, the damage had been done. Richard Rich and Thomas Wriothesley had tortured Anne so severely that her arms, legs, elbows and knees were completely dislocated. Unable to stand or even move without extreme pain, Anne Askew was carried to the stake in a chair and tied to the wooden post by chains, dying in the flames on the 16th of July 1546. Thanks to Wriothesley's and Rich's positions on the Privy Council, Henry VIII's court once again moved towards conservatism, for they held the positions of secretariatship and chancellor, which led them in attempting to make further arrests. It was Wriothesley who secured the royal warrant for Queen Catherine's arrest, but famously, the Queen somehow saw the document before it could be enacted, and was able to convince her husband that she meant no ill will. And so when Wriothesley came before the King and Queen, he got the mother of all clippings around the ear, with the King screaming at him, "Arrant knave, beast and fool." This humiliation was especially damaging, given that Wriothesley's faction was once again in decline. By September 1546, Wriothesley and Rich were outnumbered by the Reformists, and the former's hatred for Edward Seymour had deepened so greatly that the Privy Council meetings often broke out into full-blown brawls. At the end of King Henry VIII's reign, Wriothesley had lost control of the Privy Chamber, with Seymour emerging as the most dominant voice, made all the stronger on account of the fact that his nephew was the king's heir. Following the king's death, Wriothesley could do nothing to prevent Seymour from taking control, in defiance of the late king's will, which had stipulated that there was not to be a protectorship. He was, nonetheless, one of the executors of Henry's will, and in accordance with the dead king's wishes, was created the Earl of Southampton. He was named as a member of the Regency Council that would rule collectively during Edward VI's minority, although, as I said a moment ago, Edward Seymour would totally dominate, being the first among equals essentially. Richard Rich was also an assistant executor of the will of the king and received a grant of lands for his services. A month into the reign of Edward VI, Richard was elevated into the peerage, becoming Baron Rich of Lees on the 26th of February 1547. The following month, the long and mostly harmonious working relationship between Wriothesley and Rich came to a close. Wriothesley was abruptly dismissed from the chancellorship on charges of selling off some of his offices to delegates, and he lost his seat on the Privy Council. It would be Richard Rich who succeeded Wriothesley as Lord Chancellor. Wriothesley was later readmitted to the council, and he took a leading part in bringing about the fall of Edward Seymour, but he had not regained his former position when he died on the 30th of July 1550 at the age of 44. No exact cause of death has ever been ascribed, although one contemporary said that he died worn out with age. His former ally and at the end usurper, Richard Rich, was however far from being done with life. He freely supported the Lord Protector Edward Seymour in his policies, including reforms in church matters and the prosecution of his brother, Thomas Seymour. That is, until the crisis of October 1549, when he quickly jumped ship and joined in with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. This is not to suggest that it was all smooth sailing for Richard Rich, and his relationship with Dudley did not last long. For in 1551, a cock-up, which to be fair was not entirely his own fault, left him having to resign his long-sought powerful position as Lord Chancellor of England and Wales. Richard Rich had wrote a friendly but nonetheless manipulative letter of warning intended to be sent to the imprisoned Edward Seymour, but it was somehow instead delivered to the also imprisoned Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. The Duke of Norfolk used this letter as leverage to try and secure an early release from the Tower, which, although unsuccessful, showed John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, that Richard Rich could not be trusted. Nonetheless, throughout the reign of King Edward VI, Richard Rich claimed to be a staunch Protestant. Thus, along with Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, he oversaw the destruction of all images and idols, Catholic idolatry, across England's churches and abbeys. He was also heavily involved in proceedings leading to the arrests and imprisonments of conservative and later avowed Roman Catholics, most notably Bishop Edmund Bonner and Stephen Gardiner. Taking things a step further, in his role as Lord Chancellor, Richard Rich worked tirelessly to ensure the Eucharist Mass was not celebrated, arresting those performing Mass for the young king's eldest sister, the Lady Mary. It was Richard Rich who personally delivered a letter to the king's sister, commanding her to cease in her practice of the Catholic faith. Upon the death of King Edward VI in July 1553, both Mary and her younger sister Elizabeth were famously usurped in favour of Lady Jane Grey, and it was this, despite his shocking treatment of Catholics over the last 6 years, that Richard Rich then used as leverage to ingratiate himself with Mary Tudor. Naturally, he had been approached to show support for Queen Jane, but knowing that he had no friend in John Dudley, Richard Rich flipped his support and proclaimed his loyalty to the woman that he had previously persecuted, Mary Tudor. It was this fact that upon Mary's accession, having removed Lady Jane Grey, that the Queen showed Richard Rich no ill will, and would in fact spend a few days visiting Richard and his family at his home in Wanstead before riding into London triumphant as Queen. So, what, I hear you ask, was Richard Rich's most noteworthy service to the realm in Queen Mary's reign? Well, it should come as no surprise, but the no-good bastard quickly became one of Queen Mary's most active persecutors, orchestrating the arrest and execution by burning of all convicted Protestant heretics in his home county of Essex. Perhaps to make amends for his previous work as Chancellor of the Court of Augmentations, Richard Rich worked towards the large and unfinished task of restoring the monasteries. Based on this, it'll therefore come as no surprise to anyone that when Mary died 5 years later, Sir Richard Rich rode into London with Queen Elizabeth Tudor when she ascended the throne, firmly by her side. Despite his lifelong willingness to go along with whatever the monarch decreed, Richard Rich would show Elizabeth I his only ever act of defiance when he refused to support the Act of Uniformity, voting against it in Parliament's House of Lords with the Roman Catholic minority. Perhaps in this moment he realised that even though he had spent his life changing his will to whatever would suit him best, that this particular act would have been seen for what it was had he not gone along with it, given his vociferous actions against Protestants in the reign of Queen Mary. As I mentioned earlier, Sir Richard Rich lived a long and colourful life, and in his last years there is evidence that he showed some remorse for his former behaviour, or, if we're being less generous, was attempting to show some humility and penance before his eventual meeting with God. He founded a grammar school in Felsted, which in time would educate 2 sons of Oliver Cromwell, and he also set up some houses from which alms would be delivered out to care for the poor. Richard Rich died in his bed on the 12th of June 1567 at the relatively grand old age, for the time, of 70. A cause of death is not known, and he was buried in Felsted Church. Almost ever since breathing his last, Richard Rich has a very well-deserved reputation for immorality, financial dishonesty, double-dealing, perjury and treachery rarely matched in English history. He is almost universally agreed upon as being one of the very worst people from the Tudor court, with the historian Hugh Trevor Roper calling Rich a man of whom nobody has ever spoken a good word. And whilst this is undoubtedly true, for the man was clearly immoral. In fact, by modern standards, we probably characterise him as a sociopath. Equally, his knack for self-preservation is in some respects admirable. What is so astonishing about Richard Rich's story, perhaps much more so than Wriothesley's, is the fact that he behaved in this way during an era in which society was built almost entirely around religion. Richard Rich would have believed in God, and yet he behaved in a way that went so far against the teachings of the church that it's actually quite remarkable and almost impressive that he had the bravery and the tenacity to see it through. I think what is most shocking is that he got away with it. Why did no one see what he was doing? He went from monarch to monarch, favourite to favourite, twisting and turning his views, and he largely came out of it unscathed, as did Wriothesley, which, although shocking, is also, as I said a moment ago, quite impressive. Both these men, Rich in particular, had more lives than a cat, but this could not stop ultimately what came after their respective deaths, when the depravity of their behaviour, most notably towards Anne Askew, came to light and is viewed through a more modern lens. Both men were remarkable in their own way, but they built their careers by walking over others with impunity before they inevitably turned on each other. And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. In addition to this, my main episode, I also release a weekly subscriber-only episode via Patreon or Apple Podcast subscriptions. To access this, just head to patreon.com/The Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening to the show, and speak soon.